The African American Civil War Freedom Foundation, incorporated in 1992 under the leadership of Dr. Frank Smith Jr. The mission of the African American Civil War Freedom Foundation was to build a memorial honoring the African American soldiers and sailors who served during the Civil War. On July 18, 1998, Dr. Frank Smith Jr. and Secretary of State Colin Powell dedicated our memorial at 10th and U Street Northwest. There we have a statue called the Spirit of Freedom, and on the walls behind that statue, we have the 209,145 names of all the soldiers who were officially brought into the Bureau of United States Colored Troops, separate department of the U.S. Army, established May 22, 1863. So during the middle of the Civil War, a separate department of the U.S. Army was established to accommodate soldiers of African descent. Every first Saturday, we have a descendant of one of those soldiers, or sometimes many of those soldiers, whose names are on that wall, come in and tell their story. The story of how they researched and discovered their soldier. The story of how what these soldiers did before, during, and after the Civil War.
I am just so thrilled to be here today. Again, I'm Sherry Williams. I am a descendant of Nero Cooper, and he had 5 brothers in addition to himself who were participants in the Civil War. I've got a little display here with PowerPoint. It's just going to guide you through sharing with you the tremendous story that was passed to me through the ancestors from about 1967 up until 1994 through one ancestor by the name of, I'll pass this picture around. This would be Gertrude Hale, who was the eldest granddaughter of Nero Cooper. And so you need a lot of help when you're documenting family stories, because one person hears it one way and another hears it another, and so you go back repeatedly to just double check that you actually hear what you heard. This gives you an outline of how I actually put a tree together to show how the first Nero Cooper, born in 1813, had the son Nero Cooper, who is my great-great-great-grandfather. And these are the other sons of the original Nero. Now, all of the sons, starting with Nero Cooper, born 1838 and died 1900, were mustered in together into the 12th Regiment, Company A, U.S. Colored, some call it volunteer soldiers. They were mustered in Elk River, Tennessee, Maury County, all in the month of July of 1863. Well, how did I conclude that Nero Cooper was an ancestor? My research started just based on the oral history that my eldest maternal great aunt, Gertrude Hale, provided to me and made me repeat over the years back to her. She would recall the story and ask that I tell it back to her to make certain that I had it. And this is Gertrude Hale here, standing in front of her home in Indianola, Mississippi, which is a delta part of Mississippi. And my grandmother, her next to youngest sister, Gladys Sanders. Now, family history is preserved and protected and shared through mostly informal gatherings, sitting on porches and kitchen tables. And collecting it seems to be the hardest part that has happened for me, because our family has migrated all over the United States. So I have ancestors here in Washington, relatives here in Washington, some in Sacramento, Los Angeles, Chicago. It goes all over the United States. And so when the migration took place, they took documents and photographs with them. So collecting it has been a challenge. U.S. Senator Henry Cooper and a lawyer by the name of William F. Cooper. And William F. Cooper was who went up against all of his family members and decided that he wanted to be a part of the Union efforts. And what's important about this particular record is that it doesn't show Booker being married to his wife, so I need to find out when were marriages performed in Tennessee. but it does show his wife being in the same household with his 2 children. And so when you pull up Ancestry.com records, it'll show everyone in the household, but you may not pay attention to race on it. So you really need to take a look at it, because here you have all white family, but then you've got 4 people in the family with the same name, but they're black. So this is another record that if you'd like to take a look at, you can. Now the reason why I brought up my ancestry as being African is because part of the oral history that was provided by my Aunt Gertrude was that Booker Cooper changed his name to Bilal the Moor. And there are some records that were provided over the internet that showed his use of the last name Moore, but not the first name Bilal. But within a family, there are nicknames that are given to people, and then there's given names that people have. And often records won't show you those changes, but she was so adamant about saying that Booker Moore changed his name to Bilal the Moor. And so I could never find him as Bilal the Moor, but I found him as Booker Moore, you know. And he changed his name when arriving in Mississippi from Booker Cooper to Booker Moore. And so that 1870 record moves that entire family to Mississippi with the same dates of birth and everything else consistent, but just the last name was changed from Cooper to Moore. And how she recalled this history to me was she said that he had changed his name because he didn't want the captive's name, and he also wanted to reclaim his identity as an African. I understand also that he was Muslim, and so as I took a look at the faith practices in the Mississippi area, I didn't find any synagogues, temples, any places that even Muslims practice. That all I saw was mostly AME churches in the area that my family had lived in. And I did hold on to some of the records that was provided by my aunt. And those were deeds for purchases of land to build a church on. And so the oldest deed I have is from 1900, where Booker Moore and my Aunt Gertrude's husband put their funds together and purchased land and built an AME church. And it's named Hale Chapel, and it's still standing today. So some of the documents that I was able to secure from census records, from state library services, did at least list his year of birth, his participation in the Civil War, and his migration from South Carolina, Tennessee, Arkansas, and Mississippi. So this movement would have also been the movement for Nero Cooper as well. So Nero Cooper and Booker Cooper, his brother, both moved from state to state, all living in the same household as their captives. And so their records show this in the census reports on how they moved about the country. So you gotta follow where they go. So not necessarily is an ancestor gonna remain in the same town that maybe you thought they were born in, or you thought that the ancestors lived in. You really need to look at other states as well. And so using the African American soldiers and sailors records, I was able to, you know, get started with discovering the Civil War ancestry for my ancestors. And I just want to read to you quickly how this story was told to me. And those that have sat and listened to oral histories will probably understand why I'm reading it this way, because this is the way it was told to me over and over and over again. My great aunt would just start out, she'll just say, Mama had an uncle. He was a slave. Sometime after the end of the war, he changed his name back to his African name, Bilal. He had been named Booker Cooper by the slaveholder family named Cooper. and he would correct those who would call him Booker that his name is Bilal. He also gave himself the last name Moore. He would ask that all call him Bilal Moore. He said he was a Moor, an African. He would travel by mule to visit my mama, and that would be Minnie Canterbury photograph I showed earlier. He could not move from sitting on the back of the mule, so he would just visit from the road. He had some kind of problem with his knees. His feet would drag alongside the mule he rode, and friends and family would saddle him so that he could take his trip to Inverness, Mississippi, from Louisville, Mississippi. Bilal the Moor, 1840 to 1905, was the younger brother of Nero Cooper, 1838 to 1900. Civil War records indicate that he was enlisted in the 12th Regiment, Company A, U.S. Colored Infantry Volunteers in June 1863. He was a fifer, a musician, in the ranks of 6 other Cooper servants in the regiment. 1880 census records note he was born in Virginia. And that's how the story was told to me over and over and over again. So here's where the research comes in. It's going back to those primary records, those original records that were created at the time of the war. And here's one for Booker Cooper, AKA Booker Moore, Bilal the Moor. This is a record of his not only participating in the 12th Regiment U.S. Colored Infantry, but also being a part of Company A in the Alabama Colored Infantry. So he left from serving in Tennessee to serving in the Alabama Colored Infantry. And I thought that was unusual. So I'm going to pass this piece around too if anyone would like to take a look at what an original record would look like. And this one is of Washington Cooper, who is another descendant of my family, the brother of Nero Cooper as well. And one of the things that also was very hard to do was to match family members up according to their names, because most of them named each other the same name. They named their sons the same name and their grandsons the same name. So you have to be very mindful of the dates. And then there's even more records that come out of the registry. The earliest ancestor that is connected to the oral history and the documents is 1785.
And what was that?
That would have been Nero Cooper's father. His name was Ben Cooper, and the captives were, I don't know particularly why they documented so much of their family life, which is part of the Tennessee State Archives, but a part of their the Tennessee State Archives is this Cooper family's documents. So they kept documents from the early 1600s all the way until 1980. And so I had the benefit of them writing so many details about who was on the land and how they separated and how and when they migrated and why they left Virginia to go to South Carolina, left South Carolina to go to Tennessee, left Tennessee to go to Alabama, left Alabama to go to Mississippi. And they took all of my ancestors with them. And so every time they moved, they made these very rich details of who was going with them and why. So in the case of Nero Cooper, his father, who was a part of that original record, him being born in 1813,